The news of Alexander Pierce's death spread through New York's elite circles like wildfire. At 67, the self-made billionaire's sudden passing shocked the city's upper echelons, but nowhere was the impact felt more dramatically than within the marble halls of his Fifth Avenue mansion. The family butler, Harrison, discovered his body in the study, or so everyone thought. Just 3 days earlier, Alexander had stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching his family arrive for their weekly Sunday dinner. His daughter Victoria's latest sports car, her fourth this year, screeched to a halt at the entrance. Without acknowledging the doorman's greeting, she stormed inside, perfectly manicured fingers furiously tapping on her phone, likely updating her 3 million Instagram followers about some perceived slight against her influencer status. Minutes later, his son James's chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce pulled up. Even from 50 stories up, Alexander could make out the 2 models hanging on his son's arms, different from last week's entourage. At 28, James had never held a job, claiming he was building his personal brand, a euphemism for club hopping and squandering millions on failed ventures that never made it past lavish launch parties. Last to arrive was Emma, his wife of 30 years. She emerged from her own luxury car, her 4th shopping spree this week evident from the designer bags draped over her arms. The woman who had once been a passionate art teacher now measured her worth in carats and couture. Alexander's chest tightened as he recalled their humble beginnings. He'd built Pierce Technologies from nothing, working 18-hour days while Emma taught art to support them. Victoria used to sit on his lap during rare breaks, dreaming of becoming a doctor. James would follow him around the garage, where he tinkered with prototype circuits, asking endless questions about how things worked. But somewhere between his first million and his first billion, everything changed. The hunger for success that had driven him was replaced in his family by an insatiable appetite for excess. His children's ambitions dissolved into an entitled torpor. His wife's creativity withered beneath layers of luxury. That Sunday dinner was the final straw. Victoria bragged about firing her personal chef for serving non-organic grapes. James casually mentioned totaling his 3rd Lamborghini this year, laughing about the peasant whose family car he'd destroyed in the process. Emma barely looked up from her phone, interrupting only to complain about their neighbor's charitable gala competing with her upcoming fashion show. Looking at their faces, his beloved family transformed by wealth into strangers he barely recognized, Alexander Pierce made his decision. Sometimes, love requires the cruelest of kindnesses. Sometimes, to save your family, you have to destroy their world. 3 days later, Harrison would find a note and an empty study. And the Pierce family would begin a journey they never expected, orchestrated by a man who loved them enough to lose them in order to save them. The mahogany-paneled conference room at Pierce Associates felt more like a funeral parlor than a law office. Victoria, James, and Emma sat in rigid silence, their black designer mourning clothes a stark contrast against the cream leather chairs. Mr. Davidson, Alexander's longtime lawyer and confidant, cleared his throat as he opened the thick manila envelope containing the will. "Before we begin," Davidson said, his voice unusually grave. Mr. Pierce recorded a video message to be played before the reading. The massive screen behind him flickered to life, revealing Alexander's familiar face. He looked tired, older somehow, but his eyes held their characteristic intensity. "My dear family," he began, "if you're watching this, I'm gone. Over the past decade, I've watched something far more tragic than my death unfold, the slow death of the people I loved most in this world." Victoria shifted uncomfortably, her fingernails clicking against her phone screen. James suppressed a yawn, while Emma dabbed at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. "Money. Money," Alexander continued, "was meant to be a tool to build our dreams. Instead, it became a weapon that destroyed them. Victoria, you were going to cure cancer. Now you cure hangovers with $500 IV drips. James, you wanted to build things that would change the world. Instead, you break things, cars, relationships, trust funds. And Emma, my love, you once said art was your soul's voice. When was the last time you painted anything besides your face?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Victoria's phone slipped from her fingers. James sat up straight, his Playboy facade cracking. Emma's hand froze mid-dab. "So I've made a decision," Alexander's recording continued. "As of this moment, the entire Pierce fortune, Excluding this building and a modest maintenance fund for Harrison's retirement will be donated to the Global Education Initiative, effective immediately. All accounts have been frozen. All properties, except the main residence, will be sold. The company will be restructured as a non-profit organization. Chaos erupted. Victoria leapt to her feet, screaming about her social media contracts. James started laughing hysterically, convinced it was an elaborate joke. Emma fainted, collapsing into her chair. "This is impossible," Victoria shrieked, mascara running down her cheeks. "Daddy wouldn't do this to me. I have responsibilities. I have followers." A memory flashed unbidden 12-year-old Victoria in a too-big lab coat, proudly showing her father the science fair project she'd worked on for weeks. When had that determined young scientist transformed into this sobbing socialite? James's laughter had turned to rage. He overturned his chair, advancing on Davidson. "Fix this. I have deals pending, parties booked, people expecting." Another memory, James at 10, presenting his first invention at a school competition, a simple robot made from spare parts and determination. Now he couldn't even change a light bulb in his penthouse. Emma had recovered consciousness but remained silent, her perfectly curated world crumbling. She stared at her reflection in the darkened screen, barely recognizing herself. 20 years ago, she'd sold her last painting a piece. Alexander had loved to buy her first designer bag. It had seemed like such a small compromise at the time. "The residence," Davidson continued over the chaos, "will remain available to you for 6 months. After that, it will be converted into an art school for underprivileged children." "An art school," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. Furthermore, Davidson pressed on, "all credit cards have been cancelled. The staff, except Harrison, have been given generous severance packages and dismissed. Your personal accounts remain your own, though our records show none contain more than a few $1,000s. Victoria collapsed into her chair, frantically checking her banking apps. James punched the wall, crying out as his knuckles met solid wood. Emma sat in stunned silence, her manicured fingers tracing the outline of her wedding ring, the simple band Alexander had given her before the money, long ago replaced by a giant diamond, but kept in a jewelry box as a reminder of what, exactly? There must be something else, Victoria pleaded, her influencer poise shattered. A trust fund, an offshore account, something. Davidson shook his head. "Your father was quite thorough. He spent the last year liquidating assets and transferring funds. Everything was legal and binding. When I was 16, James said suddenly, his voice hollow, I crashed my first car. Instead of letting me face consequences, Dad bought me another one the next day. Said he never wanted me to feel the way he did growing up poor." He laughed bitterly. "I've never even paid my own phone bill." Victoria's phone buzzed incessantly. News of the Pierce fortune's dissolution was already breaking. Her followers were jumping ship, her sponsorship deals evaporating in real time. "This will ruin us," she whispered. "Perhaps," Davidson said quietly, "that was the point." The video screen flickered once more, showing Alexander's final words, "This isn't punishment, it's an opportunity. Find yourselves again. I believe in who you were. More importantly, I believe in who you could become. I love you enough to give you the only thing money can't buy, a second chance." The screen went dark, leaving the Pierce family facing their reflections and themselves for the first time in years. 6 months passed like a fever dream. The Pierce family's fall from grace wasn't so much a descent as it was a plummet, their lives unraveling thread by expensive thread. Moving day arrived with brutal finality. Victoria stood in her vast walk-in closet, now nearly empty except for the basic clothes she'd once worn only for her relatable content posts. Her hands trembled as she packed away the last Hermes scarf, one of the few designer pieces she hadn't sold to maintain her rapidly dwindling lifestyle. "Your car's been repossessed," Harrison announced from the doorway, his voice gentle but firm. "The taxi to your new apartment is waiting." Victoria's laugh was hollow. A taxi. When was the last time any of us took a taxi? She glanced at her phone. Her follower count had dropped from 3 million to barely 50,000. Her last sponsored post had been weeks ago, and her DMs were filled with mockery rather than adoration. Downstairs, James sprawled on the marble floor of the foyer, surrounded by moving boxes. His friends had vanished along with his black American Express card. The models, the hangers-on, the so-called business partners, all gone. His phone had been shut off last week when he couldn't pay the bill, a humiliation he'd never imagined possible. Master James Harrison said, "The movers need to take the last boxes." "Don't call me that anymore," James muttered. "I'm not the master of anything now, am I?" In the garden, Emma sat alone on a stone bench, staring at the wilting roses she'd never bothered to learn the names of, despite employing 3 gardeners. Her social circle had evaporated like morning dew. The women who'd called her their dearest friend now sent their regrets to lunch invitations or simply didn't respond at all. The charity board she'd sat on suddenly had no vacancies. The galas she'd chaired found new patrons. The family's new reality was a 3-bedroom apartment in Queens, the only place they could afford with their pooled resources. The building had no doorman, no elevator, and neighbors who didn't care about the Pierce name. Their first night in the apartment was a symphony of complaints and accusations. "This place is smaller than my old bathroom," Victoria wailed, pacing the cramped living room, "and it smells like normal people." "At least you have a room," James snapped from the couch that would become his bed. "I'm sleeping in the living room like some college student." "Both of you, please," Emma interrupted, her voice tight with tension. "I had to sell my jewelry to pay the security deposit. None of us are happy about this." "This is all Dad's fault," Victoria declared, collapsing onto a second-hand armchair. "How could he do this to us? What kind of father destroys his family's life?" "Our life was already destroyed," James said quietly, surprising everyone. "We just didn't notice because we were too busy buying things." The silence that followed was broken by the rumble of the subway, passing nearby, a sound that would become the background music to their new existence. Their attempts to navigate ordinary life were both tragic and comic. Victoria's first grocery shopping trip ended in tears when her credit card was declined. James spent 3 hours trying to figure out how to use the laundromat. Emma burned dinner 3 nights in a row, having never cooked without a chef. The blame game became their favorite pastime. "If you hadn't spent millions on your stupid influencer lifestyle," James would shout at Victoria. "Oh, like your constant partying was any better," she'd fire back. "At least I had an income." "Both of you waste everything you touch," Emma would interject. "Your father and I gave you every opportunity." "You're one to talk," Victoria would snap. "How many handbags did you buy last year, Mum? 50? 100? The arguments always ended the same way, with doors slamming, tears falling, and the heavy silence of a family realizing that without money to cushion their conflicts, they had no idea how to relate to each other. 1 month into their new life, Victoria's phone lit up with a notification. Someone had posted a video of her arguing with a barista over the price of a latte. "Former billionaire's daughter can't afford coffee," the caption read. The comments were merciless. That night, she sat on the fire, escaped their new version of a private garden, and deleted her social media accounts with trembling fingers. James spent his days walking the city, passing the clubs he used to own and the restaurants where he'd dropped thousands on champagne. Now he counted quarters for subway fare and learned the art of the dollar slice. Emma found herself standing in front of art supply stores, staring at brushes and canvases she could no longer afford, remembering the passion she'd traded for luxury. Their only constant was Harrison, who, despite having his own comfortable retirement fund, visited weekly with groceries and gentle advice. He never mentioned Alexander, but his presence was a reminder of the life they'd lost, or perhaps, though they couldn't see it yet, the life they'd been freed from. One evening, as the family sat in their cramped living room, eating takeout they'd pooled their last dollars to buy, Victoria voiced what they'd all been thinking: what if this isn't temporary? What if this is just life now? The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their new reality. But none of them had an answer. But for the first time they were all asking the same question, and maybe, just maybe, that was a start. The turning point came 3 months into their new life, though none of them recognized it at the time. Victoria sat at their scratched kitchen table, surrounded by rejected job applications, when she noticed a help wanted sign in the window of the small pharmacy below their apartment. "A retail job," she muttered, her initial disgust warring with desperation. 2 hours later, she was wearing a blue polyester vest and learning to operate a cash register. The same fingers that once clutched designer purses now counted change and stocked shelves. The first time a customer yelled at her over a coupon, she cried in the break room. The second time, she handled it with unexpected grace. "You're good with people," her manager, Sarah, told her after a particularly busy shift. "When you're not trying so hard to be important, you're actually quite genuine." Victoria thought about this as she walked home, her feet aching in shoes that weren't meant for standing. She'd spent years cultivating an online presence, curating the perfect image, yet here she was, making real connections over a counter in Queens. Meanwhile, James's transformation began with a broken pipe in their apartment. With no money for a plumber, he turned to YouTube tutorials. 3 hours and several minor floods later, he'd fixed it. The sense of accomplishment was unlike anything he'd felt buying companies he never understood. Word spread through the building about the handy guy in 3 billion. Soon, James found himself fixing leaky faucets, installing ceiling fans, and learning the value of work that actually helped people. He started charging modest fees, then enrolled in evening classes at a technical college, his hands now calloused from tools rather than smooth from moisturizer. "Never thought I'd see a Pierce learning plumbing," Harrison commented during one of his visits. James shrugged, a smudge of grease on his cheek. "Never thought I'd enjoy being useful." Emma's awakening was more subtle. It began with finding her old sketchbook while unpacking boxes. The pages were filled with the art she'd abandoned for a life of luxury. One afternoon, unable to afford her usual salon appointment, she found herself buying a $2 pencil instead. She started sketching again, first the view from their fire escape, then the faces of people on the subway. One day she gathered her courage and approached the owner of a small coffee shop about displaying her work. "They're different from your old style," the owner observed, studying Emma's sketches of city life. "More real, raw." "I am different," Emma replied, realizing the truth as she spoke it. The family dynamics shifted too, almost imperceptibly at first. It started with shared meals not out of tradition now, but necessity. They learned to cook together, Victoria reading recipes from a borrowed cookbook, while James figured out their temperamental oven. Emma discovered she had a talent for making sauce, muscle memory from watching her Italian grandmother decades ago. Their conversations changed. Instead of competitive boasting about purchases and parties, they shared small victories: Victoria's first customer compliment, James's successful repair jobs, Emma's sold sketch. They began to see each other as people rather than competitors for status. One evening, during a blackout that affected their entire block, they sat together by candlelight, playing board games found in their building's free box. Victoria's genuine laugh, not her practiced social media giggle, echoed in the darkness. James told stories about his repair mishaps, poking fun at himself rather than others. Emma shared memories of her early days teaching art, her voice warm with rediscovered passion. "I saw one of my old friends today," Victoria mentioned during the game. "She pretended not to recognize me." And Emma asked, noting the lack of bitterness in her daughter's voice. "And I realized I didn't care." Victoria smiled. "Sarah at work remembers my birthday and covers my shift when I'm sick. That feels more like friendship than all those years of parties." James nodded, dealing another round of cards. "Remember my old business partner, Chuck? He's opening another club next week. Used to think that was success. Now I'm helping Mrs. Rodriguez in 2A install a security system so she feels safer, and that feels more like success than any deal I ever made." Emma studied her children's faces in the candlelight, seeing past the shadows of who they'd been to who they were becoming. Victoria's features had softened, the perpetual look of judgment replaced by genuine warmth. James's eyes had lost their restless gleam, finding focus in purpose rather than pleasure. The next morning, Emma set up her easel by the window. As she painted her children sharing breakfast at their small table, she captured not just their images but their transformation: Victoria's proud exhaustion after a long shift, James's quiet confidence in his new skills, the comfortable silence of a family rediscovering itself. Harrison arrived for his weekly visit to find them laughing over failed attempts at homemade pizza. He stood in the doorway, unnoticed, watching as they worked together to clean up the flour-dusted kitchen. In their cramped apartment, surrounded by second-hand furniture and discount store supplies, the Pierce family had found something that had eluded them in their mansion themselves. The knock came on a Sunday evening, exactly 1 year after Alexander Pierce's death. Victoria was measuring cough syrup for an elderly customer's prescription. James was sketching designs for a small contracting business he'd started, and Emma was teaching an art class to neighborhood children in their living room when Harrison appeared at their door. "There's someone you need to see," he said quietly. "All of you." They followed Harrison to a familiar black car, the same one that had once been part of their fleet. The drive was silent, heavy with unspoken questions. When they pulled up to their old mansion, now converted into an art school, confusion turned to shock. There, standing on the steps, was Alexander Pierce. Victoria's prescription pad crashed to the floor. James gripped the doorframe so hard his knuckles turned white. Emma swayed, her paint-stained hands covering her mouth. "Dad," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking. Alexander looked different, thinner, grayer, but very much alive. "Hello, my darlings." The explosion was instantaneous. Victoria lunged forward, her fist connecting with her father's chest. James let out a roar of rage, while Emma simply collapsed onto the steps, tears streaming down her face. "How could you?" Victoria screamed, all her practiced pharmacy calm evaporating. "We thought you were dead. We mourned you." "Did you?" Alexander asked quietly. "Did you mourn me, or did you mourn the money?" The question hit them like a physical blow. "Come inside," he said. "I'll explain everything." In his former study, now an art classroom cluttered with children's paintings, Alexander revealed the truth. He showed them the surveillance reports, the secret accounts tracking their activities, the careful orchestration of his death with Harrison's help. "I watched you all," he said, pulling up videos on a laptop. "Every step of your journey." The screen showed Victoria patiently explaining Medicare plans to elderly customers, staying late to help them understand their options. Another clip captured James teaching a free home repair workshop at the community center. There was Emma, her face alight with joy as she taught art to children who couldn't afford private lessons. "You were spying on us," James's voice trembled with anger. "Playing God with our lives." "I was saving them," Alexander replied. "Look at yourselves, really look. Victoria, when was the last time you checked your follower count?" Victoria touched her phone reflexively, realizing she hadn't opened Instagram in months. "James, what's in your wallet right now?" "Tools," James answered automatically, "and about $40 in cash." "Emma, what did you do this morning?" "I painted," she whispered. "I taught. I created." Alexander's eyes filled with tears. "A year ago, you were strangers living in the same house, competing for status and attention. Now look at you, really look." They did. Victoria saw the calluses on James's hands, proof of honest work. James noticed the genuine smile lines replacing Victoria's practiced pout. Emma observed how her children now sat close together, instinctively supporting each other. But why? Emma's question was barely audible. "Why not just tell us?" Alexander sat heavily in a child-sized chair. "Because you wouldn't have listened. You were too insulated by wealth, too convinced of your own importance. I tried for years, family meetings, therapy sessions, cutting off allowances. Nothing worked, so I had to take drastic action." By destroying our lives, Victoria's anger hadn't fully subsided. "By giving you a chance to build real ones," Alexander corrected. "Victoria, you're helping people every day, just like you wanted to as a child. Different path, same heart. James, you're creating and fixing things, making a real difference in people's lives. Emma, you're teaching again, sharing your passion instead of hiding it under designer labels." He opened his briefcase, pulling out documents. "The Pierce fortune still exists. It's been growing, actually, thanks to some careful investments. But before I reveal anything else, I need to know, what do you want to do with it?" The silence that followed was profound. A year ago, they would have launched into demands and plans for extravagant purchases. Now, "The art school needs better supplies," Emma said slowly, "and maybe a scholarship program. My customers at the pharmacy, some of them can't afford their medications," Victoria added. "A foundation for medical assistance. The community center needs repairs," James chimed in, "and proper tools for the workshop program." Alexander's smile was radiant. "That's what I needed to hear." He spread the papers on a paint-splattered table. "The Pierce Foundation is already established. With your help, it can do real good. But this time, you'll have earned the right to manage it." "And the money?" James asked, his voice uncertain. "There's enough for comfortable living," Alexander assured them, "but not excess. Never excess again. The bulk will go to causes you choose, initiatives you build. You'll work for it, manage it, understand its true value. Victoria stood, her pharmacy vest still on, and faced her father. For a moment he feared she might strike him again. Instead, she hugged him fiercely. "I hate what you did," she whispered. "And I understand why you did it. And thank you." One by one, they joined the embrace. James, still smelling of sawdust and paint, Emma with charcoal smudges on her cheek. They held each other, this family that had been broken by wealth and reformed in its absence, stronger at the mended places. "Welcome home," Alexander whispered. "Not to this building, it belongs to the community now, but to yourselves. Welcome home to who you were always meant to be." 2 years after Alexander's return, the Pierce family gathered for a very different kind of Sunday dinner. They sat around a modest table in Emma's new art studio, a converted warehouse space that doubled as a community art center. The walls were adorned with students' artwork, including a striking portrait of Alexander painted by Emma herself, capturing both his cunning and his kindness. Victoria arrived straight from the medical clinic she'd established, which provided affordable healthcare to the neighborhood that had taken them in during their darkest days. Her designer clothes had been replaced by practical business wear, but she carried herself with an authenticity that no amount of money could buy. The foundation approved 10 more medication assistance applications today, she announced, serving herself from a casserole dish she'd learned to cook and actually enjoyed it. "And 2 of my pharmacy students are graduating next month." James entered last, apologizing for his lateness. He'd been overseeing the completion of a housing renovation project for low-income families. His contracting business had grown, but he kept it intentionally small, focusing on community projects rather than profit margins. "The community center's youth workshop is full again," he said, accepting a plate from Emma. "Those kids have so much potential, they just need the right tools and guidance." Emma moved between her family members, her artist's smock spattered with paint from her morning class. The Pierce Art Initiative, her brainchild, now provided free art education to hundreds of children across the city. Alexander watched his family with quiet satisfaction. The Pierce fortune had been restored, but its purpose had been transformed. The majority was carefully invested in social impact projects, managed by the family with a wisdom that only experience could teach. They maintained comfortable lives but chose simplicity over extravagance, purpose over status. "Remember our first family meeting after everything changed?" Victoria asked, passing the bread. "When Dad showed us those surveillance videos." "I wanted to kill him," James chuckled. "Now I understand we needed to die to ourselves to really live." Emma squeezed Alexander's hand. "We lost our wealth but found our worth." The Pierce Foundation had become a model of responsible philanthropy, with each family member contributing their unique perspectives and hard-won wisdom. Victoria's healthcare initiatives, James's community development projects, and Emma's arts education programs worked in harmony, creating lasting change in communities they once would have ignored. Their personal lives reflected this transformation. Victoria had found love with Sarah, her former pharmacy manager, their relationship built on genuine connection rather than social status. James married a community center volunteer who challenged him to keep growing. Emma's art was featured in galleries, but she was most proud of her students' exhibitions. "I've been thinking," Alexander said, setting down his fork, "about what real wealth means." The family listened, not with the forced attention of their past, but with genuine interest. "It's not just about giving money away," he continued. "It's about investing in human potential. Every person you help at the clinic, Victoria. Every skill you teach, James. Every child you inspire, Emma. That's true wealth multiplication." They'd kept their apartment in Queens, converting it into a transition home for families in need. Sometimes they'd visit and sit on the fire escape, remembering the lessons learned there. The Pierce name still carried weight in New York, but for entirely different reasons. When people spoke of the Pierce family now, they talked about their community programs, their hands-on involvement, their genuine commitment to change. To Dad, Victoria raised her glass of water. They'd all discovered they preferred it to champagne. "Who loved us enough to let us fall?" "To second chances," James added. "To real wealth," Emma smiled. Alexander looked at his family, truly looked at them. His daughter who had traded influence for influence of a different kind. His son who had learned that fixing things could fix him too. His wife, who had rediscovered her soul's voice and helped others find theirs. To love, he said simply, the only fortune that matters. They clinked glasses as the setting sun painted the studio in gold, their shadows casting perfect circles on the floor, a family whole again, wealthy in all the ways that counted. 3 years to the day after Alexander Pierce's death, a video appeared on social media. It showed the Pierce family at a community center grand opening, surrounded by the people whose lives they'd touched. The greatest wealth, Alexander's voice narrated over the footage, isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in lives changed, in moments shared, in purpose discovered. The camera panned across Victoria, teaching young pharmacy students, James mentoring apprentices in his workshop, and Emma leading an art therapy session. Their faces glowed with genuine joy, not the manufactured happiness of their past social media posts, but real, earned contentment. They say money can't buy happiness, the narration continued, but its absence taught us what true happiness is. Sometimes, losing everything is the only way to find what really matters. The final shot showed the entire Pierce family at their weekly dinner, now hosted at the community center, where all were welcome. The table was longer, the faces more diverse, the laughter more authentic. This isn't just our story, Alexander concluded. It's a reminder that it's never too late to change, to grow, to become who you were meant to be.